Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're going to be talking about the best practices around inputs. Now, the height of your input should always be consistent with other input heights. I would even say sometimes you need to make sure that your button and your input heights are all very consistent. I will sometimes make chunkier buttons or, taller buttons because I want people to definitely click on them, but I'm going to make sure that, if my inputs are 40 pixels in height or something like that, my buttons are definitely going to be something like 56 pixels, so they really stand out and there's enough contrast. If we look over here to the right here, we'll see that looks much better in comparison to the one on the left. Let's move on to the next best practice. So we have the input field length. Now, all inputs in a form should be the same length, but that is going to vary depending on the type of answer you may ask the user to answer. A good example is when we ask users for their credit card information. The CVV number input file shouldn't be too long because it's generally only 3 digits. Sometimes having long inputs for short answers could confuse the user into thinking they may have entered a too short answer. Now, I would say one of the only exceptions to the rule is this, where, having them on the same line work really well together. They kind of work in tandem, so I don't really mind this as much. Okay, this one seems maybe like a no-brainer, but let's jump in. Your labels should be short and clear and easy to read. It's best to keep your labels short and sweet and to the point. 1 to 2 words is generally enough to describe what is being asked. And the label should contrast the input font. Generally, people will bold and shrink them a bit. They also lower the opacity sometimes, so I keep it basically a bit lighter than my actual content within here. So if I just turn on that, it's a little bit smaller, it's a little bit lighter, it's going to work much better. And let's take a look at the label over here on this side. Much better instead of just, carrying out this label into a sentence. Another tip is to make sure only the first letter is capitalized for easy scanning and readability. So I'm a big proponent of that and making sure that, I'm using kind of sentence case. Let's talk about something else that there is some debate over. Placeholders. Okay. Now, to placeholder or not to placeholder. I think I just butchered Shakespeare there. I'm sorry. Anyways, placeholders at their best show repetitive information, and at its worst, it hides important information and reduces accessibility. You may be asking why. So when a user clicks on a placeholder and starts to type in an answer, that automatically replaces that placeholder with whatever the user inputted. And this can be a problem if the placeholder is being used as a label or even as a hint. So maybe it's great for things like email and maybe password on a login screen, and you don't necessarily need a label because it's a design pattern that's, commonly understood. But think about the date of birth and thinking about the type of, information or the way we want them to input that data. I wouldn't use it as a placeholder. At that point, the user can no longer see that text when they've actually filled in the input and can't review their answer. So as for accessibility, they are a little harder to see just due to the lightness of the color and are often undetected by page readers. So I rather put them in in a description below or underneath a label or to the right as an optional label. Okay. Now let's talk about icons. So icons in forms can be really, really helpful. You may be thinking icons and inputs. Who would have thought? Let's go over the 3 different scenarios that, we often see. Aesthetic reasons. So sometimes they really serve no purpose but to just reinforce the label or whatever is asked of a user. These are generally in line with the input and just left to the text. So you can think of a search icon or a little email icon. And I think even the credit card icon is pretty helpful sometimes because they will switch it out to show that, this is maybe a MasterCard or a Visa. So that could be really helpful. The other scenario is actionable icons. Some icons will add functionality to your input, which is really great. Some examples of this are chevrons or these arrows pointing down over here. They're often used for things like drop downs, and they can show and hide information, and they can help give the user additional ways to interact with your input. Look at this one here, password visibility switcher. Usually there's like an I here that's crossed out where you can't see the password, but if you click it, and then you can see your password. And now feedback. This one's pretty important. These really help users to understand if an action was successful or not. These are often used in addition to color, and that is super important for accessibility because some colorblind users cannot tell the difference between red and green, and they will rely on icons. So in this example, we have like the wrong username, so it's invalid username, and then a valid username. So it could really help just with little things like that. Let's talk about states. Now, there are a bunch of states that we need to think about when designing inputs. Different states tell the user what is currently happening and what they should do next. These states can be differentiated with things like text, color, and yeah, that's basically a text color. There's even effects. Sometimes people will use like drop shadows and stuff like that. These visual cues are pretty integral to a good input. Let's jump into the different types. So we have the default state. This is what you're probably most used to seeing. This is the default state, and it just shows an empty field that hasn't been interacted with yet. Then we have an active state. This field is active, and that happens when the user clicks into it. This field has a highlighted border, and sometimes we'll have, maybe a drop shadow. They'll have a caret that's blinking over here to show that the cursor's there, and that they should be typing something. Then we have the filled state. Once an input is filled, the user has entered the information and clicked away from the field. Now it looks much similar to the default input, and I think we all understand that this has been completed and they can move on. Okay, now we have our disabled inputs. Now, sometimes we will see these and when we run into this case where an input should be disabled due to a requirement or maybe a restriction, disabled inputs are really shown as kind of sometimes filled in or grayed out to indicate that you really can't interact with this. So usually, it's grayed out like this with a fill instead of the white. Okay, and our success and error states. Sometimes we will see success states. When an answer is correct, you have the option to show a success message. These are less popular than error states because, most of the time we're successful when we're filling out forms. Similar to the error state, we're definitely going to use things like color, icons, and the appropriate text to really communicate that, something was successful. Now, the error state is a bit more popular. When an answer is incorrect or maybe even missing, the input should show an error message. The message generally should have the appropriate color, icons, and text, and be in line instead of outside of the form. Underneath the corresponding input is fine, like we saw with the success message as well. We kind of touched upon this before in our lesson about just typography and using, error states and using icons and text to really, really drive that point home. Okay. Let's talk about something that's really important now. This is super important, assistance. There will be times when a user comes to an input and needs a bit of assistance, a tip or a hint. This will help the user fill out your input much quicker if you do it right. Here are certain ways we can provide assistance to our users. Hint text is number one. Use hints above or below your input field to give the users helpful information about the question you are asking them. Whether that's a message or a note underneath, or like this for the date of birth. The auto format. We have the power to automatically format a user's answer depending on scenario. This avoids any format errors and helps users read and review their answers. Think credit card numbers, phone numbers, even dates can auto format. Autocomplete. Sometimes users need to enter something long or they may not necessarily know what they are searching for, and we should help them with autocomplete. This saves the user a bunch of time and also reduces the possibility of errors with formatting and spelling. So think of like the address option here, or even if like, somebody is searching up like, what are your favorite types of chips? Like, okay, I'm going to start typing S for like salt and vinegar, and I'll see, that as an option pop up, and I can quickly press enter. So really, really great option to use something like that as an autocomplete in those types of scenarios. Okay, this one's another one that's pretty interesting. Default values. It's always smart to pre-fill your fields with the most likely answer when the answer is expected by the majority of your users. So one example here is if I come over to this form, many people want their sign-in information to be saved. It's often something that's unchecked, and I personally hate it. I don't want to enter my information over and over again. Sometimes, people will not do it because of a security measure. So just something to think about. But, whether it's like maybe a checkbox that's already pre-checked, or maybe it is like you're an input that is already pre-filled with certain text, like maybe, your city is pre-filled or your country is pre-filled based off of your location or based off of the majority of people in your area that have like used the same service. So definitely some options there in terms of like how to use default values. And those are the best practices for inputs.